There we go. Good morning. So the format today is we're going to have an hour of basically our four speakers doing quick, not quick, but great talks, and then we're going to take a little break, and then at 10 o'clock we'll start the panel. So kudos to all of you for being here and getting the most out of the day. And I'm not going to belabor introductions right now because we'll do that at the panel. But please trust me, this is a self-sovereign identity blockchain brain trust, and I'm really excited. So I'm gonna, this part will not be on the YouTube videos, so I'm just gonna get out of the way. Welcome, thanks for coming, and our first speaker is Brad Witterman from Everest, and I will let him take it from here. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. By way of introduction, I've been doing startups for far too long. I'm about to seriously date myself. I got out of grad school, did my first startup in '93, worked in mobile telephony, and identity is quite important through mobile telephony and understanding who an individual is, and went from there to distributing content for Hollywood. And in that context, identity is also very important. So, just starting off very high level, this might be a little bit remedial for most of the people in the room, but just to set the level bar, what is identity, and are you sure that what you think identity is identity? Who gave you that identity? And your identity isn't a piece of plastic. As you can tell, all three of these are spoofs. They're not actual people. Well, Jerry Seinfeld is, but that's not really his card. Your identity is really made up of three buckets: who you are, biometrics; institutional attestations about who you are, so governmental, like a birth certificate or a driver's license; banking, like an ATM card, or a utility bill, or a diploma, which is a school claim that I did something specific. You also have a series of community endorsements, things that the community has said about you. Now, this gets very interesting in a networked world. Things like Airbnb reputation score is directly transferable to VRBO. That information that I have spent 5 years renting from Airbnb and successfully paying them should be reflected to VRBO when I make my first rental, right? Rental and payment history. So, Everest started from a very specific standpoint, that we are creating a utility for humanity. By starting at that point, we had to do some very specific things. We decided to start with biometry, the knowledge of the individual, and build up from there. So we start with the biometry of the individual, add in institutional attestations, add in community attestations. Why? Why is this important? Because there are a ton of people that are affected by a lack of identity. There's the 1.1 billion that you've heard repeatedly mentioned that are people that are just unidentified. On top of that, there's another 450 million that were at one point identified, lost their identification card, never had value derived from the identification card, so never bothered to get another one. So those people are effectively in the system but lost. You also have the 2.6 billion people that have no bank account or no access to banking. There's about 375 million people that have no ability to KYC, so they're not able to join the banking. And there's about 5 billion people on the planet without a smartphone. Those 5 billion people on the planet without a smartphone aren't going to be buying one soon. Something like 40% of the world population makes less than $5 a day. You can't blow $500 on a smartphone if you're making $5 a day. This is the magnitude of the impact we're talking about. This is the impact. What you're looking at is the G20 and everybody else. Everybody else is 20% of the world GDP, but that's 40% of our population. Why is that? Because of a simple problem in identity. If you are unable to demonstrate your identity, you're unable to get access to cheap capital. Cheap capital pools in the Western world where identity is easily solved and easily resolved. In the frontier markets, the cost of capital can be 10 or 15 times the cost of capital in the Western world. To borrow $1 million in Jakarta will cost you 20 points. Why? Because you're in Jakarta. That doesn't make any sense, and that's not sustainable, and that should be solved. If we solve the cost of capital problem, we solve a lot of problems downstream. People can get access to the capital and can grow an economy. If we can take this 20% of the economy and invigorate it, we might be able to double it. And if you're able to double that $20 trillion to $40 trillion, what's the net impact to that 20% of the world population? It's huge. So these are all of the different effects of an identity gap. The first one I was just talking about, the cost of capital in the frontier market. There's access to aid programs. The World Food Program can't give you food aid unless they know who you are. They are very, very painfully aware of the leakage in their system. They lose 18 to 20% of the money when it leaves Geneva or Rome and gets driven out into the world. And that is just to friction in the system. With the distributed ledger technology, you can take that friction in the system out. The capacity for graft goes very remarkably down when everything is on a transparent ledger. Anyone who's cheating gets found very quickly. You lose your social contract, your right to vote, to attend school, to obtain social services. The capacity for a self-sovereign identity to solve a lot of these problems is on the cusp of being realized. And that, to us, is very exciting. Our focus on the frontier world and in bringing an identity to the unidentified has led us to believe that the future of the 21st century economy is an inclusive identity plane. Everyone needs to have an identity to be able to play in the digital world. In the Everest system, you get an identity called an EverID, and matched with it, you get a wallet called an EverWallet. Why? Because the capacity for an individual in the frontier market to figure out the technology to get a cryptocurrency wallet is very, very low. The ability for them to get a self-sovereign identity on top of a cryptocurrency wallet is also even less. So by marrying these two together, when you're enrolling someone to get an identity, they're automatically in the digital economy. They already have an endpoint that the World Food Program can put vouchers for food aid into. We're taking the 8th century to the 21st century in one step. So this is a transaction with identity platform. The reason I say it that way, not an identity platform with transaction capabilities, is because that's really the focus. We're a transaction system. We create a voucher mechanism to enable almost anything to be digitized and sent through to an individual and biometrically verify that that individual alone was the one that received it. Now, taking a step back to the governance of all of this, this is a key critical component. Who owns their identity? We believe the user should own their identity, and the user alone should own their identity. They should have complete control of everything, including their biometrics. So within our system, we have the EverID and the EverWallet. The EverID rides a specific blockchain which is operated by the Identity Network Foundation. This is a foundation set up in Switzerland, endowed by Everest, and self-perpetuating because the majority of the funds for verification of identity go directly to the INF. Now, that's critical because my data is parked in a foundation whose sole responsibility it is to protect my data. Now, when you're creating a utility for humanity, you need to consider that there's going to be a lot of people that have no capacity to understand what you're actually doing with their data. A frontier agrarian society member isn't able to conceptualize what you're saying. They're able to conceptualize that I'm recording your identity and I'm giving you the capacity to interact in a digital world. They're not going to understand the intricacies of how we're recording it, where we're storing it, all of that. It's up to the INF to make sure that their data is protected. Sorry, the build's a little funny. So what we're building, or have built, is a platform for all 7 billion people on the planet. This is specifically what we're designed to do. We scaled the transaction platform for a stupid number of transactions, basically to be able to scale to consume the entire planet's economy. Why do we do that? Because that's the only way that this whole system works. Everyone needs to have an identity. Everyone needs to play in the digital economy. And when you get to the point where everyone is in the economy, you can do wonderful things like solving all of those problems with the identity gap. Okay? The focus on biometrics, I want to come back to very briefly. For our system, we have the capacity to plug in any biometric system. Right now, we use face and fingerprints, and we require at least 2 forms of biometry. Why do we do that? Deduplication, all the different types of risk that you have in one form of biometry go away when you have a second form. When I can take multiple fingerprints from you, I can do additional verifications of your identity. I can also do things like coercion keys, which is a specific order of digits which tell the system that I am currently under distress and that whatever action that I am currently taking should be nullified. We have the capacity of taking trigger keys. So if I give you a specific order of digits into the system, it can do specific things, like a shortcut. I want to send a remittance to my grandmother in the Philippines. I do this every month. I don't want to sit there and spend 20 minutes configuring this. I just want to go to a shortcut. We can make all of these simple user interface elements elegant by reusing this biometry system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad. Everest is did you want to go over these slides, Brad?
These are just use cases.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go to the next.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brad. So Everest is a company that has recently came above ground, and for those interested in this space that are not aware of them, I would encourage you to check them out. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Renaris, and is coming to us fresh from the UK, where she was briefing Parliament on some data and some identity issues. So we're really glad that she snuck us in, and I'm really excited to have her deck show up. There we go. So with no further ado, is this the deck you wanted to have? I'm sure you'll pull it off. Is there a different one? Do you want me to?
No, it's green and had colors. Can you see the next one? Oh yeah, that's fine.
There you are.
I'll make it work. You can go back.
So, Elizabeth.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. So yeah, it looks a little different, but hopefully the rest of it will flow smoothly enough. So my name is Elizabeth Ranieris. I am Global Policy Counsel at Evernym. Evernym is a startup based in Salt Lake City that is building our vision of what we call self-sovereign identity, which I will get into, obviously. And actually, yeah, this is missing a key feature, which is the title of my presentation. That's the subtitle. The title is The New Relationship. What I want to talk about is at a very high level what blockchain-based or self-sovereign identity enables, which is this idea of a new relationship. So start with the basic premise that we all know we're more connected than ever before. Why is this switching? There we go. So the large increases in connectivity are actually, most of the gains are coming from the developing world, which is really important in the context of this conversation. But of course it means that if something were to go wrong, right, the risks are significantly higher. So not only do we have this quantitative, okay, this is really looking different, it's okay. So not only do we have this quantitative increase in growth, but we have this, this rate of change is also increasing. So this was a timeline basically showing the time span in between innovations shrinking rapidly, and the nature of those innovations also amplifying the effect of this connectivity. So obviously tremendous opportunity, so we have companies now reaching trillion-dollar market caps and beyond, but of course a lot of that has been based on, I don't know why this isn't, monetizing our data, right? So tremendous risks as well. And so we all know about some of the recent breaches and some of the costs of these very lucrative business models for these companies. And of course, the most recent one is actually not Cambridge Analytica, right? We thought things got pretty bad there. And then thereafter, they continued to get worse. So in the most recent one, of course, it demonstrates the problem of a newer model of identity known as federated identity or single sign-on or social login, which is the fact that if you used Facebook to log into other services and companies and sites, we actually don't know the extent of the breach because this breach will have impacted all of the other places that you would have been logged in via Facebook. So we can't even measure really what the impact is, but we know that it's probably a lot worse than we think it is right now. So we've moved from the first model of having your credentials to log into a website to the second one of federated or social, and we still have a lot of problems. And the reason for this is because despite all the innovation, we still don't have a good way of proving who we are online or remotely at a distance. So who am I? How do we do this in the real world? Well, I've told you that my name's Elizabeth Ranieris and that I work at Evernym. But how do you know that? How do you trust that? So I might give you my business card, and it might have my name and my details on it. Or you might go to our website and might see that I'm the only woman on the website there. And you might know that these are what we call credentials, right? And in the real world, we have credentials of all kinds, and they usually take the form of paper, or you might reference them online like this. But there are other things about me that you might not know, right? So you might not know that I was a classmate of Zuckerberg, that I participate in the Blockchain Observatory, or that I'm a yoga instructor. Mike knows that. But these things aren't really relevant in this professional context, right? So we have these context-dependent things that we need to be able to prove through the use of these credentials, and those will depend on the relationship that you're trying to establish. So how do we do it in the real world? So in the real world, we have this universal standard called paper, right? We use paper of different kinds, and we can combine this paper and mix and match it in ways depending on the context where we need to prove something authoritative. And so the passport, of course, is sort of a global standard of the gold standard of paper for proving identity-related things. And this is how we establish trust in the real world. Sorry. Oops. Go back. Right. So the problem, of course, is that we don't have any way of doing this in a remote setting, in a digital or online world. So I don't actually like the word digital because everything will be digitized eventually, right? All our credentials will be digitized. We will be digitized. So it really is over the remote relationship that's the issue here. And the reason for that, we all know, is because here's the design of ARPANET, or the early internet back in the 70s, and it was really designed to move packets around, right? This is just packet switching, and it wasn't designed for things like sharing cat videos or social media or other things that might require some level of identity or knowing who's behind it. And of course, this is what led to the famous cartoon of on the internet, no one knows that you're a dog, right? And multiple spin-offs of that. And the reality is, after more than a quarter century of this, it's still pretty much the situation today, is that we really don't know who we're interacting with on the other end. So this slide got a little messed up, it's fine. So the problem, of course, is that you are basically renting your identity from each service or company that you interact with online. So you've got the entity at the center, and you've got these folks that are basically individuals that are renting these credentials to access services. And the problem is that we have this for each different entity or service, which means that where basically it's like they're creating their own internet, right? For each entity, they have their own rules and their own way of establishing your identity, which isn't actually yours, but is basically loaned to you. And this, of course, multiplies at scale when you think about all the things that we now do online or at a distance. The average person has over 40 of these, actually, sets of login credentials. So this also means that our data is now proliferating all over the web and that it's living everywhere and replicated everywhere, but without any control over it. And this is also obviously creating massive friction. So, the struggle of creating the password and locking yourself out, creating login usernames and passwords is still a tremendous friction and cost to doing business online. It also means, that we have all the breaches that I alluded to earlier. And this friction is really, it's not just a business friction, it's not just a personal friction, but it really is impeding the relationship that we want to build with these entities. So we want a better customer relationship, we want a better constituent relationship, we want better constituent engagement, and actually the constituent citizen piece is really important to the panel discussion later. So the friction is the problem. And so if we can fix the online trust problem, we can fix identity as the foundation of that trust online, then hopefully all that friction will go away, which will be a tremendous breakthrough. So we like to say a new identity is coming. It sounds really scary, but it just means we've gone from the traditional siloed data model where you've got myriad usernames and passwords to the very high-risk federated model of the recent Facebook breach where you've now basically breached access to all your other services, to what we call self-sovereign identity. Oops. So Gartner recently featured Evernym as a cool vendor in this space. And they basically agree with us that just like you start life with a birth certificate or that paper credential that lives in the real world, we should basically start our digital lives with self-sovereign identity. So what does that mean? So some people refer to it as blockchain-based identity, decentralized identity. I'm about to fall off the stage here. We call it self-sovereign identity, and the term is a little bit controversial, but basically what we're talking about is this lifetime portable identity fully controlled by a person, organization, or thing that cannot be taken away. Now, there's a lot of nuance packed into that, which we can get into later on, but just at a high level, that's what we're talking about. So it actually works like the way that it works today in the real world, or the offline analog world, but actually enhanced and a bit better, so more secure and cross-border. So it works today in the sense that if I use my passport now somewhere to prove my identity, the State Department isn't getting notified, right, that I've used my passport, or at least not that we know of. But we want the same thing in the digital world where you don't have to have every interaction mediated by the issuer of the credential, and they don't need to be part of that. They don't need to sit in between the relationship or the service that you're trying to access. So this is what we mean by the new relationship. So we think this paradigm shift of this peer-to-peer connection is the opportunity to enable new relationships, ones that are more, that are unique, that are peer-to-peer, and so they're unique to that relationship. They're more secure. They're private by default, and we're very focused on privacy and data protection by design default, and they're verifiable because they have this technical element of verification. And again, no middleman that can turn them off or that can snoop and know what's going on. So Brad mentioned this earlier, but ownership we view of your data as a fundamental human right. Now, it's really important in this context, and Mike knows I'm very passionate about this. Ownership does not mean that it's governed by property law or contract law. It means it's a fundamental civil or human right that cannot be taken away from you. And again, we can get into that in the panel. But what we think makes this possible in our new economy is really the decentralized technologies that we can leverage, like blockchain. So Evernym has created a custom-built ledger called the Sovereign Ledger, which is now controlled by a foundation called the Sovereign Foundation, so that it remains open. And the way you can think about it is if Bitcoin is decentralized money, Ethereum is effectively decentralized applications or dApps, Sovereign is what we think of as decentralized identity. So it's uniquely built for that purpose. So what are the core features of it? And we also get into this in the panel, but open source is really fundamental to everything that we're doing. We want everything to be built on open standards. There's a lot of community work going into it, and everything is basically under an Apache 2 license and fully auditable. We also have a very robust working group of global contributors who have been designing and crafting all the standards, policies, procedures, and agreements, and also operating the nodes in our network. And those operators of the nodes are called stewards. So we have this hybrid model where the nodes are operated by stewards who've been part of a qualification procedure, and that we currently have about 50 stewards all over the world, from various industries and geographies and sizes. Anyone can contribute. If you're interested, we can talk about becoming a steward, contributing code, running pilots, various different things. And also, everything, as I mentioned, is fully public and auditable. So Our trust framework, which is our governance document, which you can also consider a governance framework, is fully public and auditable. Everything is published in a GitHub repository that's publicly accessible. And so there's absolutely, it's full transparency around how everything's operated in the network. And these are just, some of the people. This is actually an outdated slide now, but as I said, a wide array of stewards who are from all different industries and geographies. And recently, the World Economic Forum basically, this is their slide and their big red arrow pointing at us as an example of kind of where you want to be on the self-sovereign spectrum. So there is this external recognition that's happening now about the ability of our design, our ledger, to really enable this kind of privacy-enhancing self-sovereign identity. So I love this slide because I do think that we talk about a lot of crypto voodoo sometimes, and really there's a lot of advanced tech here, and sometimes it is indistinguishable from magic, but there is something very magical about it, which is that we've gone through these connection brokers because we've had to, but who actually wants to be sharing their updates via Facebook or their photos via Instagram or their messages via WhatsApp? We don't care about that. We want to be connecting with the people on the other end, but we've been forced to go through these connection brokers who stand in the middle of those relationships. But imagine if we could do them, if we could reconstruct them and just go peer-to-peer to all the people that we're trying to reach with those messages and those photos and those updates. And imagine if we could do that with everything from entities to individuals to even our cars, right, our smart cars or our smart tech. And that's really what self-sovereign identity is about. It's about enabling these secure peer-to-peer channels with the things that we're trying to access directly. And again, core to this is that when you can build out that trust and you know who you're dealing with at a distance or remotely, all the friction goes away. And this is what enables what I referred to earlier as the new relationship. And the new relationship is significantly more meaningful. So you might have not just more connections, but you might actually want to utilize them more because there's more trust in those relationships. And there's more of an intimacy actually between the service that you're connecting with. So from our view, there are myriad benefits here with the new relationship, and these are just some of the obvious ones, and there are a lot more nuanced ones that we can get into as well in the panel. That's all I've got, and there was a photo on here, but if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out and also follow me on Twitter at HackyLawyer, and that's what I've got for you this morning.
Yeah, we'll do questions in the panel. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'm so excited about this morning, and you guys are so lucky that you came for the first hour because you've heard Brad and Elizabeth basically talk about two platforms that are clearly tackling the same problem in very different ways, which we will get into in the panel. But by the end of this hour, you're going to have a lot of questions, and hopefully we'll explore some of them in the panel, and then you'll have time to ask them. Our next speaker is Kalia Young, who has been in the identity space for a while. I have formal introductions I'm going to use in the panel. But Kalia, unlike the previous two speakers, is a standalone entity in this web. She is her own show, but that doesn't mean that she doesn't touch a lot of different organizations. And when I met her, she was one of the first people who took me under their wing, sat me down, and said, "This is what you need to understand, Mike." And I'm so grateful for that. She has a couple of publications to her name, which she will no doubt tell you about. And I'm really glad that she flew out from California to join us, where she was at the WEF Young Leaders Conference. So I'm not alone in my admiration for her. Please welcome Kalia.
It's great to be with you this morning. So I thought I'd start at the beginning. I founded the Internet Identity Workshop with some colleagues in 2005, and we are still convening. We began meeting really asking this question: how can individuals own their own digital identifiers? How can we get out from being underneath the platforms that we're interacting with? Just a username and password, or now more recently you have these intermediaries like Google and Facebook that you're using to log into various things. And then if you got yourself your own identifier, how do you actually prove meaningful things about yourself using that? And the good news is, after 15 years of convening, we've gotten somewhere. Our next one's actually happening next week, and you're all invited, of course. And there's a whole set of open standards around self-sovereign identity that have emerged. And I'm going to touch on them really briefly, and then at the core of them is this, the decentralized identifier. And it's an identifier that individuals themselves create, along with a public key and a private key, and they can post them to ledgers. And there's lots you can read online about the technical details, and I'm not going to go into them now. There's not enough time. But I invite you to explore them. And conceptually, at the top, you have identifier owners. Oh, yay. Then you have the next layer. You have individuals have digital tools that work on their behalf. So at the core of this is a wallet that they would probably carry on a smartphone. And then next you have what is happening in the cloud, so that individuals will have agents that are cloud-based that are connected to their wallet. And these are also under their control. And the vision for these is that they act much more like a bank does today. We go and we put our money in a bank, and the bank helps us do things with our money, but it's still our money. We go back to the bank and go, I want my money, I'm going to take it to the other bank. The same should be true with our data. It shouldn't break down if we choose to change service providers and those that are acting on our behalf with it. And then next you have, as has been mentioned, a shared ledger, distributed ledger technology, of which there are quite a few different folks. Sovereign is one that's been named here already, that are supporting this. And it's really a routing infrastructure. There isn't very much information stored on these in the distributed ledger. It's really a way to go find and connect, right, between agent to agent for individuals, and to connect using public key infrastructure. And the other thing that you can do with this is verifiable credentials to support the movement of attestations, credentials, claims, however you want to call it, from institutions to individuals. So where do these verifiable credentials come from? And one source is registries, and this is what I'm really grateful for Mike's work, is kind of to go, oh, right, okay, that's one way to look at them. And I spent the last, can we get my slides not? Like, they're going to creep up by the end. The good thing is it's all being, it's being recorded, and then they can cut this part out when they put it on the internet for real. So we'll just take a break, figure it out. So I'll tell. Okay. Thanks for your patience. I spent the last 2 years at UT Austin in their new Masters of Science in Identity Management program. And I'll tell you a little bit of the story, and then I'll walk through what we have. In that program, we were in a cohort of 12 folks, and we would get new teachers, right? This happens in a cohort program. And we kept talking about identity as if it was one really big thing. And I was like, wait a second. There's different forms of identity in different places, and we need to have a framework to think clearly about it. And so this is actually part of Mike's paper. So what are the different places that PII, personally identifiable information, ends up in databases? And this is the anchor for how I thought about dividing up the world of identity into some manageable chunks. And so at the core, at the top of this is me and my identity. And this is the place where I, as an individual, collect and manage and store my own information. And we have several varieties. User-centric digital identity, this is what the folks I've been supporting convening at the IIW have been working on for a long time. There's the indie web efforts. Folks have been working on these challenges in that context. You have the quantified self movement, which is all these tracking and all sorts of tools for people to manage and track their own information. And now this new kid on the identity block, the self-sovereign identity work. So this is me and my identity. Next is a category that often gets overlooked, but how do elders, children, folks with disabilities, and others manage their identity? They do it with folks acting on their behalf. So you have you and my identity or delegated relationships that we need to have accountability in the systems to support folks who aren't managing their own identities, having others do it on their behalf, but in a way that means they're not giving away their credentials, that there's accountability. So these are the sources for data and identity information in the next 12 domains, and we're going to step through them. So the first one is government registration. And there's two forms, really. There's primary registration, which is done by parents on behalf of their children. This is when you register your child's birth at the county level, and now, more recently, also with the federal government to get the issuance of the Social Security number. And then also, secondary registration is all the registrations you do after that, often yourself, using those primary documents to get a driver's license, to get a passport. All kinds of different things need you to get another identity issued to you by various governments. And all of these systems and processes are very recent inventions. Most of them are less than 100 years old. And there's a loop that happens, actually, where modern states came into being in part because they went out and registered their citizens, who then thought to themselves, I'm part of this thing called the state. So it actually forms a recursive loop in terms of people's sense of identity when these processes are put in place. And this is a map from Mia Harbitz, whose work is in the CRVS space, Civil Registration of Vital Statistics, about what happens when you have effective civil registration in terms of enabling a whole holistic picture of its impact on society. Next, you have government transactions, and this is where you show up with the documents you had in step one, which is getting registered, and you go and use them to do things, actually. And this is actually where you find a bunch of registries. You can't register your car unless you have a driver's license in which to make the connection, right? And when you do land transactions that are recorded by the government, they ask you to present government-issued ID, right? Next, we have civil society. This is a whole cluster of organizations I put together for the purposes of this, which is organizations which you have an ongoing relationship and that are providing not just commercial transactions, but health, education, many other things. And all of these institutions have a registration process and some sort of issuance of credentials that you represent when you show up to ask for those services. And you present the credentials you got through the registration process, and you're able to transact to get those services. And this is also a place where we find, ta-da, a registry. Professional licensing often happens in these types of institutions, right? This is another registry. You have commercial registration. This is where you sign up to get loyalty, a loyalty points or a customer number with a service provider. And then when you present, you show up, you share whatever it was you got in the registration process along with payment, and you get your goods and services. Next, you have employment registration. This is where individuals are applying for jobs, sharing information about who they are. Once they're offered a job and it's accepted, they're enrolled into the enterprise systems, and they get a credential, and they present that credential to do work, and in return, they're paid for that work, right? So this next category of where we end up with PII and databases is surveillance. And in my research, there were three main kinds: voluntary known, involuntary known, and involuntary unknown. And this happens across all of the contexts that I've already gone through. So you have government surveillance happening of all three types, We have civil society surveillance, so this is like CCTV cameras going into school, or various ways that people are being tracked. A lot of it's voluntary. Like I put on some sort of health monitor and it's going back to my doctor. I understand that's happening and I'm choosing it. And then you have commercial surveillance. And finally, employment surveillance. So this is really old. Taylorism is not new. So those are the next 12 domains. And then finally, you have the data broker industry that's pulling data from all of the above context, public data, data from commercial entities, compiling it into digital dossiers, and reselling it to government and the commercial sector. And then finally, all of these domains are subject to attacks on the black market, both by state actors and criminals, and this data is being spread around in that way. So there you have the domains of identity. Now, I want to quickly tie it all back together and be like, how do we actually, if you notice in all these little diagrams, there's the person. And what if we put the person at the center? Going back to SSI, using their wallet and their cloud agent, that they could collect the credentials that they get from government and then reuse them when they show up on the door of government to do transactions. They can collect credentials from their civil society institutional engagement, their professional licenses, their number from the Water Polo Association, all kinds of credentials in digital form. And when they use them, it's really easy for them. Their employment registration credentials, the credential proof that where they're employed, and use those in a much more secure way to even log into those systems of the enterprise. And then commercial registration, all their loyalty cards and points, etc., and use them. So self-sovereign identity is what sits in the middle, enabling individuals to manage all these different relationships in a way that is significantly less complex than each of those institutions need to have a business relationship with each other to see those credentials. So we are really seeing the emergence of a new layer of the internet for people, I believe, layer 8, on top of the one we have right now. And I want to close with this quote. Protocol is a language that regulates flow, direct net space, codes relationships, and connect life forms. It's etiquette for autonomous agent. And these are the new set of protocols to really enable us as people to connect to one another and connect to organizations. And I'll leave you with this. To get to this future, we need to coordinate the development of common building blocks, code, infrastructure, and protocol. We must ship interoperable products, and we need to work towards alignment and control. So with that, I thank you and look forward to the panel.
Isn't this cool stuff to think about? It's a little mind-blowing. I went to the IIW 6 months ago. It happened every 6 months, and I've been catching up ever since. But thank you very much, Kalia. So earlier on Elizabeth's slide, she said, if Bitcoin is decentralized money and Ethereum is decentralized apps, then sovereign is decentralized identity. Of course, Brad might have an addendum to that. But to come back to Ethereum, if you're at all familiar with the distributed ledger space, there are at least 2 giants, Bitcoin and Ethereum. And we now have, and Ethereum is related to, managed by, stewarded by the consensus mesh. I don't know the right words. But within consensus, the identity solution is called Uport. So from the consensus office, from the consensus office of Washington, D.C., we have Shaylee Adenolfi, who will talk about Uport and consensus. And then I hope you're keeping up your questions because we will get to them on the panel. So please help me in welcoming Shaylee.
Oh, you can't really see that, can you? It looks different on, let's see if you can see the, this says decentralized ID government led. let's see if you can see the next one. Okay, wait, there was one before that, but you can't see that either. Should we maybe see if it, I don't know why it's looking like this.
Keep talking.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Shaylee Adinolfi from Consensus. Today I'm going to talk about why the government needs to be involved in this decentralized identity movement. It's vital for governments to take part in the evolution of this trust-based ecosystem that we're all building together, Web 3.0. And I'll just stop talking because this isn't a part of the presentation.
Shaylee, just keep going.
I'll just keep going from here. Okay. So, hi, everyone. Today, I'm going to be talking about why the decentralized identity movement needs to be government-led, or we need to bring governments along with us in this evolution of identity and trust. So I'll start off by why is there so much hype around blockchain? Because these decentralized or distributed ledger technologies, that are cryptographically secure with smart contracts or business logic inherent in the systems, are said to potentially disintermediate governments and banks and those age-old institutions that we trust so much with our data, our money, our privacy, et cetera. And but I don't see it that way. I think we can support government in transforming their services to citizens. And what we're doing at Consensus and within the larger distributed ledger technology community is creating a Web 3.0, a new ecosystem of trust. And we're trying to fix some of the challenges that we face in Web 2.0, which is around identity and around transfer of assets or value. Those are the two big challenges that we have right now that we're trying to fix. So, banks and governments are the ones that are providing us with the identity documents that we have today. You go to the DMV, you present them with your marriage certificate, your social security. I mean, for every DMV, it's a little bit different. Your last driver's license, which was from 5 to 10 years ago. And this process, we have to wait in lines. It happens over and over again. And frankly, even within the same DMV, you'll have people asking you for different things. So it's quite astounding. This is all operated by governments and banks, and there's this renewal process that we have to go through to continue to prove who we are. And many of our friends in the decentralized identity space today talked about some of those challenges that we have with the issuance of identity and how we value this because we're getting that attestation from governments. And so what we've done to date, although we've had e-governance and e-government solutions, over the past 10 to 20 years come to light, we've made a lot of progress, but we still have very siloed systems. We still have different identities for security clearance, for your driver's license, for your marriage certificate, for Social Security. All of those things are still sitting in silos, and they're not talking to each other. And this is a huge challenge that specifically the US government, but other governments globally are facing, is they have a number of different identifiers for all of us, and they're not talking to each other in decentralized and in siloed systems. And it's a huge headache for them to process. So, sorry, I'm going to the next slide. Let me go back one. Okay, so what does government do? They take in data and they take in payments. They process it through paperwork and approvals, and then they issue permits and licenses. This is approximately 80% of what the government does today, right? taking in information and then spewing out these verified claims. And we want to better that system. So I think we need to bring government along in and learn from some of the systems of the past and create a new vision together with government. It's everyone's responsibility in this room because our systems are broken. And how do we do that? We explain how this will lower costs, increase transparency, and get governments back to doing what they're supposed to do, which is provide services to their citizens. Sorry, I'm having issues with, this is different than what I see here. So citizen-managed ID, user-controlled ID, self-sovereign ID, whatever you want to call it, there are a number of different services where citizens should be at the center, and they shouldn't be command and control top-down services. The citizens should be more engaged with government and vice versa around the issuance of these services. And this is where we want to transform as a community, as a blockchain community. So how do we do that? We get them involved in the conversations around some of the basic building blocks, right? Electronic signatures. It is amazing that some of these laws around electronic signatures passed in the 90s, and you still have government agencies debating whether an electronic signature is appropriate or accepted for like a simple contract. Or USAID, for example, the biodata that they have, that's an identity document around your salary history and your employment background. They're still debating whether an electronic signature is acceptable on that form. So, smart contracts, business logic built into systems. We need to have an open dialogue about these basic building blocks. So what are we doing at Consensus? We have UPort, which is focused on self-sovereign identity. And we are working with Evernym and Microsoft and a bunch, 60+ organizations as a part of the Decentralized Identity Foundation, and where we are working on open source and open standards. And those discussions are ongoing as this technology evolves and as we build it together. That's all.
Thank you, Shaylee. My apology to all the panelists for any of these technical issues. I'm really glad we have no slides for the panel. It'd be good. It's 9:57, according to this clock that stares at us when we're speaking, which means we have 3 minutes till I'm going to start the panel, and I'm going to start bang on time. So you have 3 minutes to please use the restroom, grab coffee, eat 5 bagels each, and there's a lot of bagels back there. And then we'll have all the panelists up here, and we will kick this off. Thank you so much. I'm willing to take a bet that everybody here is going to want more time for questions. So if you'll indulge me, let's get the train back on track. If I could ask the panelists to please come on up, sit in your assigned seats. So if you'll indulge me for 5 minutes, I want to tell you why we're here, why I'm here. I run a program at New America called The Future of Property Rights, which will be on the screen shortly. And our job is to do future sensing. Our job is to think about advanced technologies and how they would apply to property rights, because we believe property is one of the most powerful tools for advancing the human condition. Whether you care about the environment, whether you care about poverty, whether you care about gender, whether you care about, you name it, land is this incredible asset, and I'm not going to belabor the well-established documentation in this space. There are some incredible experts in the room. If you're surprised by what I'm saying right now, we can talk to you afterwards. So as a part of that work, I said, okay, what are some advanced technologies that are interesting to property rights? And when we started this research about 1.5 years ago, blockchain was something everybody was talking about, but nobody was. The more I listened, the more I realized there was room for improvement. So my colleague Chris and I wrote a paper about blockchain and land registries. Tim? This is the wrong panel. Whoever's watching in the back, this is the wrong slide. Take it down. Ignore the screen for a second. So we wrote a paper about blockchain and property. And that paper's been since republished by MIT. It's hopelessly out of date because it's a blockchain paper and it's now 6 months old. But it's in the course of writing that paper, I had the privilege, because I have the privilege of working here, so people take our call, of talking to a lot of entrepreneurs in the blockchain space. And I talked to people who thought about medical devices, your heart rate monitor. I talked to people who dealt with money. I talked to people with remittances. Really, you know, that wonderful feeling when you're talking to somebody who's obviously smarter than you are and they're still talking to you. And these people said, you know, I ran into this thorny problem and I wrestled with it, and then I came running back out because I realized we had to solve identity first. This was a mantra I heard again and again. We had to solve identity first. So after we finished the blockchain paper, I said, okay, let's go think about identity. And I Googled identity and I went to the Internet Identity Workshop 6 months ago, and my brain just exploded. Take a commercial break here. Tim, can you go to the back? I need the paper up, and then I need the panel slide up for our panel. And my brain exploded, and I've spent 6 months wrestling with this question of what does digital identity mean, what does self-sovereign identity mean, and what does it mean for land rights? And so I'm going to spend 1 more minute before we get to the panel giving you a commercial for this paper, which you can download today because we have finally published it. If anyone has struggled with something complicated and written a paper, you're familiar with the feeling that thank God it's done, and I wish I had 6 months to do it again, because I can tell you everything in this thing that is wrong and incomplete and inaccurate, and I need more time. So I apologize in advance for all of the failings of this paper. But I hope, if nothing else, if you manage to get through it, because it's half of it's footnotes. But there's 60 pages of thinking here. Some of it's good. And what we basically do is we say, here's this notion of self-sovereign identity that's been around for 15 years. And the paper is called A Nail Finds a Hammer, because everyone says, blockchain, you know, the haters, blockchain's just a hammer looking for a nail. That's just crazy talk. But there are these other crazies who've been talking about identity, and wouldn't it be amazing if we could distribute identity and keep identity under our control? Maybe some even crazier people who've said, it's actually a human right, it's not a property right. That would be her. And now this nail of self-sovereign identity finds the hammer of blockchain, and what's been conceptual is now possible. And what does that mean? So you've heard self-sovereign identity introduced by the people who were in the trenches. And in this paper, what we say is, here are the principles of self-sovereign identity. Everyone's got them, and here's our table saying that they're basically all saying the same thing. Here are 3 companies that we think are taking this seriously and spending real money and real intellect on it, and those companies are represented on this stage. And here's how those 3 companies address these 10 principles. And if you can muddle through that, you have a sense of what you just experienced with the speakers, which is, oh, there's a lot of different ways of tackling this and trying to wrestle this beast to the ground. But then, again, my job is to talk about property rights and technology. So that's all fun. But how does that apply to property rights, real property, land? Well, once you establish land rights, which is a whole journey by itself, you need to keep track of that in a registry. And as Kalia, I'm so grateful to Kalia for stopping and thinking and rebuilding her presentation, or tweaking her presentation to talk to my main point, which is, let's not get into the debate of, is self-sovereign identity really going to happen? How long is it going to happen? Just assume for a second it's going to come. And think about all the registries in our life, the property registries, the asset registries, the identity registries, the professional registries. See Kalia's presentation if you want others. What does a registry become in the presence of self-sovereign identity? That is the question I ask with this paper. And I don't answer it. Not ready yet. But I don't think they go away. But I do think that the registry and the registrar need to fundamentally change from being a source of truth and a keeper of data to a provider of credentials and maybe a keeper of data that I'm not going to want to keep in my wallet. Like, I was bankrupt 5 years ago. I just came up over dinner with Brad last night. That's not in the paper, but I wish it was. So that's why I'm here, because I'm obsessed with property and property rights. I think it is one of the most powerful tools we have to uplift people on this planet who aren't as fortunate as ourselves. And I think the reason Future Property Rights exists as a program is because unless we use the best technology available, we're not going to do that job fast enough. So self-sovereign identity is something that I really think is coming. I think it's brilliant, and I'm excited to see how it happens. And we attempt to tackle that problem with this paper. newamerica.org FPR is our website. And if you go to that website, this is the first link you will find. You can download this paper. And please let me know what you think, fpr@newamerica.org. So with that, this panel is brought to you by me, and that's the commercial. And now I'm going to jump into the panel. If you've been here for the past hour, you've heard most of these speakers. So I'm going to skip the introductions because I'm really eager to let you guys talk. But if you want to know more about them, please Google them. Everyone's Twitter is up here. So let me just start with the first question. And if there are things you want to share on the introduction level, please add that. But if the panel could please describe a little bit about the place you're coming from for the people who might have not been here for the talks, and also kind of why you choose to work in the identity space. I think we can all agree this is a pretty accomplished panel. They could do kind of whatever they wanted. But why are you investing your precious working years in identity? And maybe we'll just start with Elizabeth and go over.
Yeah, so for me, it's a personal pain point. So I've lived and worked in 5 countries on 3 different continents. Every time I've moved, I'd have to reestablish my identity. In my personal background, I have 2 European parents. I speak 5 European languages, and I cannot get a European passport because my family has no records because borders have changed and things have shifted. So the tremendous friction that I've experienced in my own personal life is what drew me to the idea of self-sovereign identity when I first heard about it back at the MIT Media Lab last year. So it's a personal passion of mine, and also having been a data protection privacy lawyer for the last 8+ years, I see the tremendous opportunity for SSI to correct the data models that exist today.
So my background is in economic development and financial inclusion in places like Africa and Asia. And the reason why I came to the identity space is because there are 1.7 billion financially excluded, and identity is one of the biggest barriers to financial inclusion because of KYC regulations and so forth. So that's why I'm here.
This is really good. I went to school to become an economist, and halfway through trying to become an economist, I fell into technology. And I spent a great deal of time building technology companies and making small fortunes for venture capitalists that didn't need money. So 4 years ago, I founded a company that was about using the distributed ledger for healthcare and healthcare records. And 2.5 years ago, I founded this company, pivoting away from the problem of healthcare to the larger problem of identity. Healthcare just scratches the surface of identity. It goes so far down, all the way down to every individual person and how they lead their life. So I got into identity to solve a couple of major problems that are near and dear to my heart. The financial inequality that I was speaking of earlier and the cost of capital in the frontier markets hits a lot of my friends. I went to a graduate school that's 70% international students. I've maintained all those relationships, and I see how their lives are playing out, and it personally impacts me. That's how I got here.
Cool. I've been working on identity my entire professional career, basically, and I got started after connecting to a network called Planet Work, and they were a community who had done some introspection about how could the internet and the emerging web at the time in the late 1990s serve people on the planet better. And they identified a critical missing gap, which was user-centric digital identity. How do people own and control their own identities? And they even wrote a paper called The Augmented Social Network, Building Identity and Trust into the Next Generation Internet. And they said, if we don't get user-centric digital identity based on open standards, giant corporations and governments will own all our identities. And lo and behold, 15 years later, that prediction is right, except we've been continuing to convene and gather to try to solve this challenge. And I think we're on the cusp of these new distributed ledger technologies and the open standards around them, providing a way for people to own and control their own digital identities and support all the communities of people connecting in a peer-to-peer way, not being intermediated by entities like Facebook or other centralized social networks, but by our owned and managed by ourselves in our own communities. So it's very exciting.
So one of the reasons we wrote this paper is because when you talk to these folks, you're both excited by what they're talking about, and at least I am generally confused by the very elaborate terms that are used. And then people are talking about self-sovereign identity, and then they suddenly say user-centric identity, and then they throw in federated identity, and my head just hurts. So what we try to do in this paper is make sure we walk through these things and explain some of these terms. And I want to be clear, digital identity could be centralized identity. You know, people use federated and user-centric identity a little bit interchangeably when they talk about Google and not, and there's nuance there. But we're talking about self-sovereign identity. We're talking about identity where you, the user, owns and controls your data. It does not sit on someone else's database. You and only you can turn it off. And I chose to focus my paper on that, both because it's the fuzziest and most confusing, but also because the work of digital identity has been handled by others. So I want to point out, the Center for Global Development wrote this incredible book by Alan Gelb and Anna Diafazi-Metz. And it's an incredible walk through digital identity. So that's a whole thing. And we're not talking about that. I'm not tackling that whole thing. That's been done. We're talking about self-sovereign identity, this idea that it would be controlled by the user. So the question to the panel is, with that clarification, when is this going to stop being theoretical? When is this going to actually happen in the field? When are lives going to be touched? When are people, everybody likes to sort of almost fetishize the bottom million, we're going to help the poor people one day. Like, when is that going to happen, and when is this going to be real? And if there are pilots going on, this is when I'd love to hear about them. Brad, you want to start?
Sure. So rubber is meeting the road this year. We've announced a couple of significant partnerships with sovereign governments. We'll be distributing liquid propane gas for the government of Indonesia inside of their TNP2K, which is their poverty reduction division of the Office of the Vice President. The pilot will involve 6,000 individuals who are receiving this aid, and that'll be happening later this year. Also, we've announced the Cambodian government, the central province, is going to be using EverID to track healthcare, and to track neonatal disbursements of foodstuffs and vitamins for mothers, and post-birth for the first year of the child's life.
So thank you for those examples. The tipping point, when is this going to go from pilots to?
Oh, when we succeed. Yeah, pilots generally in technology are proof points, and governments like proof points.
Fair point. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think there are two things that are happening simultaneously right now that will tip the scales. I think the first is the technology coming a long way. The mobile device becoming near ubiquitous and having sort of the capabilities that we need to manage the kind of wallets that we need and to have the autonomous agent capabilities of managing your connections and your data. I think that, coupled with changing attitudes, although they're still painfully slow to change, around the threats posed by GAFA and these large intermediaries, I think those two things coming together, we still don't have enough pain. I think we still need more pain. I think you've seen in other countries these delete Facebook days, and you've seen some backlash. And I'm very active in working with governments around the world, and you see a lot of governments very aggressively tackling this. We don't have nearly enough pain right now, I think, here to appreciate the gravity of the situation. I don't think we have enough transparency and understanding of the risks. So I think the technology coming along in tandem with the policy work that we're trying to do, particularly at Evernim, we're very focused on this policy engineering aspect to illuminate kind of the scale of the problem, have to happen together. Otherwise, our concern in the self-sovereign identity community, of course, is that a Google or a Facebook will come and do this first, and that we'll have the same trust problems that we've had all along. From our perspective, if you want a concrete example, we're very close to production level rollout with a credit union consortium of basically creating a new digital credential that will be portable across the credit union industry and globally as well. And that's a really interesting area because credit unions traditionally have been able to be a little bit more innovative than banks just because of their regulatory environments, and a lot of people in this panel have mentioned financial inclusion. And so these kind of alternative sources of credentials and identity are really interesting to us. And then, of course, I think you'll probably mention it later, but we've also got some work going on with iRespond that's pretty much live. So I think that we need to be more focused on the policy work. I think there's been a lot of emphasis on technology and not enough emphasis on the law and the policy. And I think the real catalyst is going to be from the shifting attitudes there.
Shaylee?
Yeah, so I agree that we're getting closer to the tipping point. You're starting to see policy converge with the technology. There's definitely more participation in the open source, open standards conversations, and but I think until we have acceptance for your daily transactions, like right now, I can't go to a liquor store and show my Facebook or LinkedIn profile, and they'll give me. It's just until we see that happening, you have not reached the general population, and I think we're a ways off on that with self-sovereign identity. It's going to take a lot of hard work. It's going to require adoption by government, and I think banks and governments are the ones, credit unions I think are fantastic, driver of getting this. And we don't have enough friction here in the US, like Elizabeth was saying, or even in the EU. I think GDPR is helping push some of this. But I think, in places where there is so much exclusion and the policy is so far behind, you'll see the leapfrogging of this technology where it's just going to happen.
Right.
And building on what you're saying, one of the leading early adopters in this space is actually government. The province of British Columbia has been actively building tools for their citizens and also for their different government agencies, and they're looking at this year are rolling out the issuance of verifiable credentials to businesses who are chartered with the province, along with the licensing that whatever licensing they have at the provincial level, so that the businesses now will have digital versions of all those credentials and can use them to interact with other governments like the Government of Canada without having to fax around a bunch of paper. So there's signs, like this year you will see things actually out in the field.
And that gets to the point of registries, right? So what what the BC government did, and that's also mentioned in our paper, is have a registry of companies. And that was a centralized data registry where they said, hey company, here we've gone ahead and taken this data. I'm using broad strokes here. You know, we've taken your data, we've packaged it up, come and claim it and move it into a digital wallet for your company. So that's this idea of self-sovereign identity applied to organizations. But the way I think about it is the identity is how a registry starts to wrestle with and understand what self-sovereign identity means for the future. And I'm not asking you to all be like, yes, Mike, you were right. But what's your thought on this idea of bringing registries in? Because as a property rights guy, the fact that I'm mentioning registries is almost like, of course, it's all property rights people do. So, I mean, when I've said this to you, any thoughts or how your platform would think about its interaction with registries, which I think also gets to a lot of what you said, Shaylee, of government's future role. In fact, you want to?
Well, yeah, you know, actually we just recently launched 3Box at Consensus, which is leveraging Uport, and it's, I'm reading something here because this is very new, open source data storage solution for Web 3.0 that allows users to manage private and public information on decentralized web. So the data, there's a registry on IPFS, which is the Interplanetary Filing System, and it's managed by the Orbit DB. So I think registries are critical to the adoption.
Yeah, so I think there is a little bit of a misconception with self-sovereign identity that it means that we're doing away with all the conventional roots of trust, so government, central banks, you know, universities. It's quite the opposite, actually. What it does is self-sovereign identity really enhances those existing sources of authority and roots of trust and brings them into the 21st century. So registries are incredibly important. I think those of you who are familiar with blockchain may have heard of something called an oracle or an oracle function. Basically takes things that exist in the real world assets, and translates them into what's recorded on a ledger or a blockchain. And so, of course, we have the problem of garbage in, garbage out. So registries are incredibly important, especially in the property context. If you have valid and legitimate and accurate registries that exist in the real world, being able to digitize those and leverage blockchain to kind of enhance the verification capabilities is really an incredible improvement, enhancement, and allows that direct accessibility so that you don't have to go through the land registry office or various, you know, bureaucratic agencies that might be very slow, and particularly in certain, you know, geographies and areas where some of those institutions are lacking trust and are lacking transparency and accessibility. A voting registry is a really good example, right? So we think about it maybe we're thinking about real property or land rights, but if you think about other registries that are incredibly important to make more accessible and more transparent to individuals in a lot of critical places with vulnerable populations, there's tremendous value there. The other thing I would say, though, is I would caution against, so as a lawyer, I worry about the presumption of, you know, if something isn't documented, it means it doesn't exist. I think we have to be very careful about that in the blockchain space. We have to be very careful about the fact that registries are not perfect, right? They're created by humans. There are a lot of flaws. And then further baking those flaws into an immutable record is a very dangerous proposition. So we need to be mindful and sometimes slower than we'd like to be and cautious about that. I don't want to live in a world where if something isn't on a ledger, it means it doesn't exist. And I think that's particularly important from a human rights perspective and intrinsic rights that don't require a deed or a title, you know, that exist independent of that record. So that's the only caution I would add to it.
Brad, Clea?
I would echo Elizabeth on this. I believe that the registries that exist today are critically important for us to leverage in a self-sovereign identity space. The institutional attestations and community attestations I was referring to earlier are exactly that. In Bangladesh, as an example, the community attestation matrix that they use to distribute funds to school-age children has absolutely no root in any identity other than other parents of students vouching that you're you. And they sent hundreds of millions of dollars through that capacity just based on the community web of trust.
Thanks. Clea, you've already opined on registries.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Registries are important, and the conversations with governments about how they leverage these new technologies to do what they're already doing, but in a more efficient way that's more empowering to their citizens is really happening.
And I think it's not just how they leverage SSI, but how the existence of SSI sort of forces them to evolve. Right? Registries need to, if you think about what a registry does, and we belabor this point in the paper, step one is validate that you're you. When you walk in and you want your name tied to your car, show me your driver's license, confirm your identity. If there's a functioning SSI system, what does that change? So Elizabeth mentioned iRespond, and I want to digress, and you saw me fumbling with my papers. That's because in the past 6 months of writing this paper, everybody has said to me, okay, so we're doing this really cool thing, but I don't know if you could talk about it yet. Brad and his co-founder Bob were particularly bad at that, but iRespond really hammered the point home. But in the paper, I was just checking that we were allowed to publish this. There are brief case studies in East Africa, Myanmar, and Thailand, where they were using this for health records and for human trafficking. And you're probably thinking, wait, who's iRespond? Why aren't they on stage? So iRespond is a biometric service provider that is out in the field working hard to bring digital identity, self-sovereign identity to lots of populations. And I just want to share one exceptionally cool example that iRespond mentioned to me. And he was like, the gentleman's name is Peter, he's the CEO of iRespond. And he said, you know, HIV vaccine studies are happening right now in East Africa. And if you're an enterprising young East African, if you're anybody, anywhere, and someone's paying you an incentive, you're going to want all the incentives you can get. So if there's 3 vaccine studies, sign me up. I'll take a $50 Amazon card from every registry, right? The trouble is, if you have 3 HIV vaccines in your blood, we don't know which one worked. So I desperately need to do as many studies as I can as fast as possible on these vaccines and pick a country. But once you've signed up for one, it's not okay for you to sign up for any others. And how do I do that if you want the money because there's people to feed? So the way they do that is they take the biometry, the raw biometry, they put it in a template, they hash it, and they list it in an anonymized shared directory between these different HIV studies, HIV vaccine studies. And then once you go to enroll, you do an iris scan, they check it, and if it's already in there, it's anonymized, it's just a hash of the template. Sorry, you can't enroll in this study. You've already been enrolled in a study. So that's just one example of like an innovative use of the technology we're talking about in the developing world. But what we're talking about here with East Africa, Myanmar, and Thailand is how iRespond has been using biometry and self-sovereign identity solutions to deliver aid in the manner which Brad alluded to. But back to the question, I still don't know who iRespond is. So iRespond is a biometry provider that works on the sovereign, works with sovereign. And then you were asking the question, and this is one of the things we try to elucidate in the paper. What's the difference? Like, Brad, they're all doing self-sovereign identity, right? So I can use them all. And I've taken the liberty of describing the difference this way. If you think about it, I was driving here today and I saw one of these scooters and it had on the bottom those, you know, those 2 logos we all see? Apple Store, Google Play Store, download the app, right? These 2 platforms. But if you think about it, the Google is a big, wide Android platform that you can use a Moto phone, an Android phone, a Pixel phone, whatever you want. But it's a huge platform that you can build different things on. Whereas Apple is an integrated walled garden where all things have an Apple logo on them. And that is how I, with my clumsy, non-technical, probably wrong perspective, think about Everest, and Evernym. At least you could have chosen names that didn't start with the same letter, right? So I think of Everest as an Apple solution. They are an integrated, fully baked, you walk into the Everest thing and there's Everest everything to meet your needs, including biometry. It's really fun to talk to Brad about biometry and talk to Peter about biometry. Those conversations go on forever. Whereas Evernym is trying to build this one massive platform that everybody can build different things on. And I thought incorrectly that iRespond was working on that, but then I introduced iRespond to Brad thinking I would get a good debate out of it, and they ended up agreeing to maybe work together because they can also use their biometry solutions. So there's a lot of really exciting stuff, but I think thinking about the difference between these players, the Apple model for Everest, the Google model for Evernym, and then what's Uport doing? Well, Uport's inside of this whole other consensus. No, I mean, there's this whole consensus ecosystem. So once you dive into the blockchain world and you get into the DApp world, and I realize for some people I'm speaking a foreign language, and I apologize. Then you need an identity inside that space, and could that identify port out? So and we're in the very beginning of a tidal wave, the very beginning. And I'm not saying anyone's going to win. I don't, at the end of this paper, be like, I love Evernym the most. I don't say that. I say that I wouldn't be surprised if one day we saw identify yourself with Evernym or with Everest. It wouldn't blow my, or with Uport. I wouldn't blow my mind. And that gets us to the more exciting part of this panel, where we start talking about the differences of how these things work. So one of the differences that comes up in conversation a lot is open standards versus open source. And I'm just taking us right to the good stuff here. Can you talk about the difference between open standards and open source, Elizabeth, and why you guys do what you do?
Sure. So we have the open approach, which is open standards, open source code, and open governance. And I alluded to some of this in my presentation. We think that without all three, we don't have a sustainable, interoperable solution for cross-border identity management. So the open standards bit, Kalia covered really well in her presentation around the core of it is the DID, or the decentralized identifier. So Evernym and the Sovereign Foundation have been very active, along with Kalia and others, in the W3C and the DIF as well, which Shaylee mentioned, in building out these open standards for effectively how do we speak the same language around our decentralized identity management. So the DID is, as I said, the core of that. So there are various DID methods. There's a Uport method. There's the sovereign method. There's a Bitcoin method. There are various kinds. But we want them to ultimately be interoperable, because we don't believe in a walled garden approach. We believe in this open approach. The second piece is that open source code, as I mentioned. So everything that we're doing is built on Hyperledger Indy, which is part of the Linux Foundation, which is basically, as I mentioned, the Apache 2 license, with a few exceptions there. So that's all open, transparent, and auditable. And the third piece, which is really important, which I think a lot of projects are losing sight of, is open governance. So as I mentioned, we have a public, fully transparent, auditable governance framework, formerly called a trust framework, but now a governance framework, which outlines all of our policies and procedures and processes for changing everything from a technical standard to design of the network, to how stewards are qualified to participate in the consensus protocol and validate transactions on the ledger. So everything is out there for everyone to see and inspect. And so we really feel that without, as I mentioned, all three elements, you don't have a fully sustainable solution.
Thank you. Brad, how about Everest?
That was very well put. I would characterize our approach as the Apple approach. Apple is an openly proprietary system manufacturer. They take open source tools and create a proprietary stack of those open source tools. In a very similar way, we take open source tools, make a proprietary stack, and deliver that stack. The open standards are important. Open source, we are less religious about because of some of our experiences in the open source community. For 4.5 years, I sat next to Bram Cohen, the creator of BitTorrent. And I've had many, many conversations with Bram, some of them centering around, why did you put this in the open source? And he has a very standard response. It was in fashion at the time. In 2003, that's what you did to become a cool coder. You put your thing into the open source community. I would bet that all of Hollywood and all of Nashville would argue that this was probably a bad move. Okay? It cratered 2 entire industries. That's just the facts. So that open source, probably not a great move. Similarly, Apple, with Fairplay, takes a proprietary stack of open source tools, wraps everything in iTunes in Fairplay, and sells it to you. Why do they not open source Fairplay? Because knowing the recipe allows you to attack it. Once you understand the recipe, it's a vector of attack. I can just sit here and hammer on this one thing until I figure it out. If you obscure the fact that your recipe involves these 75 steps, it's much harder to attack. So for that simple reason, there are components inside of our system that will never be open source. Other components will be open source, and some components will be derived from open source communities, which we will be providing back any enhancements to as good members of those communities.
And can you also talk about DIDs?
Sure. So DIDs are quite important. There are multiple competing standards around this. We are based on a private permissioned Ethereum blockchain, which means we are not open on mainnet. We are operating our own thing. The INF that I was alluding to earlier is the actual operator of that underlying blockchain. Inside of Ethereum, there are known as Ethereum Improvement Projects, EIP. EIP 725 and 735 are a claims registry and a claims management system. So while the IDs that are being standardized by the W3C and some of these other organizations exist, doesn't necessarily fit directly into my world because we're built on Ethereum and there's already a solution natively there.
Yeah, we use the similar standard, the ERC EIP 725. This is our proposed identity standard. The way we feel about open source, amazing. We love it. Open source is great. Open standards, we are all for it, and I think we're trying to learn from the previous attempts of, the ITU's identity standards, and then OpenID from Enterprise ID for Enterprise IDs, but we can't wait. So in the meantime, we are going to move forward with the ERC 725 and just continue to learn.
So we're both cringing.
So Leah, what's your perspective on?
So I just want to say, like, UPort isn't ERC 725. In fact, the UPort team has written a very clear distinction between their entire stack and how it's quite different than ERC 725.
Thank you. I don't work for UPort. I work for Consensus. I'm supposed to be. Thank you so much for clarifying that. Yeah.
But this is the fun stuff. This is why creating this paper was so much fun, right? Because you talk to Kalia, and there's an impassioned plea that open standards are the way, the truth, and the light, and without them we will not be saved. And then you talk to Brad, and he says this. He tells the great story about BitTorrent. And what's important to understand is, while we do believe the future is coming, and we have heard that governments are starting to do proofs of concept. These ships are, these things, the reality is.
The ships are being built as they're starting to sail across the ocean, and that's
really
true. And I think that different projects are starting in different places, right? So Brad's company's choices are informed by the market that he's going into first. The choices to center around open standards, specifically for interoperable verifiable credentials, is really rooted in companies looking at developed world contexts with significant existing registry systems that are functioning using paper. And the question is, how do you transfer those multitude of different credentials that individuals carry in their wallet and have on their walls from universities, from governments, all sorts of places? How do they collect those up in a digitally native form that's trustable by other folks when they present that? And those are two really different problems. And to solve that problem of multiple credentials from multiple sources, a really good way to get to interoperability really fast is to have open standards so that a verifiable credential is a verifiable credential. And it's easy to read and store in whichever wallet you choose, whether it's a Veris1 one or a one produced by the company Evernym, or one produced by a different company also working in the sovereign network, or one produced by UPort, right? Like, that I should be able to collect my verifiable credentials from wherever they come from using whatever software and store them in any wallet that accepts these open standards-based credentials and then present them, right? So that you're building a complex ecosystem of service providers who are all able to speak the same language even if they're using different code underneath.
And I think for us to have this paradigm shift to move what is truly self-sovereign identity has to be vendor agnostic. So we want to build it so that if we go away, your identifiers don't go away, and they're not now useless, and your credentials are still accepted elsewhere. So I think that's the problem with the walled garden approach, is that there is that vendor dependency, and that really isn't any different from the way it is now. So I really, that's why I think Kalia and I are so passionate about this, is we want to flip the paradigm. We want to take the vendor out of the center. We want to put the individual in the center, and that means that they have to be able to take that anywhere that they want to, and you know, for a long time as well, not because someone's around. So you know, again, ideally, if we go away, it doesn't change anything. You can still go and use your credentials and your DIDs, and they'll be accepted, and you know, they'll be compatible with other wallets and other agents and other pieces of technology as well.
Brad, do you want
to? Yeah.
I mean, I'm not trying to get this into a full-blown fist fight, but I just want.
There is an important distinction to make here, and you're prodding me at the exact right moment. So, there's a significant difference between a federated model and a concentrated model. Everest and EverID is a concentrated model. We take in all claims and we write them to a central datagram that you carry around with you. That datagram contains all of your claims. I don't have to go out back to my bank and say, am I really me? I don't have to go back to a government server and say, am I really me? And more importantly, if my insurance company goes out of business and that server is no longer powered, what happened to my claim? If my bank gets bought by another bank and the bank that did the acquisition didn't decide that they liked this service and turned off the server, what happened to my claim? I think it's much better for us to concentrate all of that information and allow the user control over that information. So that's a little bit of a difference between the way that Evernym sees the world and the way that Everest sees the world.
Concentrated in centralized.
Concentrated in exactly.
Just to flesh that out, what you're alluding to, I think, where are the claims that
They're in the wallet.
It depends.
It depends.
It depends. There's a lot more nuance there, and there's a lot more. So one of the things that we worry about is centralization by decentralization. So we don't want a decentralized source of truth to now be the central point of failure, right? So there still has to be this sort of multi-source, complex, layered approach. Because you can have, you know, if you have a full dependency on one ledger or on one provider, on one wallet, then you have the same problems that we have now. So I think there's just the consciousness of, but then again, it's all very early days, so we don't we don't actually know what the best approach will be. But I think it's a healthy debate to have.
Nope. I'm still learning. I just started recently.
This is the magic of this, right? It's so nuanced. And if you at the surface level, any of these guys can be given the same price like that, talk about a Facebook scandal, talk about central self-sovereign identity, whatever the idea is. But when you peel the onion and you look at what Brad's been coding for years, and you look at what Elizabeth just explained to Parliament, and you look at what Shaylee's working on, which is part of a much bigger ecosystem, you look at the ways to think about 50 years. There's very different design decisions. We're in this room, I'm looking at Cadasta, who does land rights in the field using tag. If they were to go forward and do something, which platform would they use? And that what we attempt to do in this paper, because again, I'm always selling my latest work, which is free, by the way. I'm just selling it. What we try to do in this paper is give you, the uninitiated, a way to start thinking about just the questions you would ask if you walk into the room with any of them, as well as, Kalia dropped some names in there, Varus one, Moody. There are other people in this space who, there's a lot of people who say they do self-sovereign identity. And because for some it's a catchy term. And maybe they do self-sovereign identity, maybe they actually do KYC. Depends. So, but that's just a glimpse into some of the internal controversies here. So let's take us to one of the external controversies. One of my favorite papers that the World Bank has recently written is an assessment of biometric platforms in the world. And they very nobly created a framework. They have a great circle saying, you know, here are the different things you need to think about with biometry, and let's go through each of these platforms. And then we're going to red, yellow, green the different slices of these pies. And I joke it's the yellow circle paper. Because even though they wanted to red, yellow, green everything, basically everything in that paper is yellow. Right? It's a big, I don't know, we'll see. But I mentioned this a little bit with iRespond, but if you guys could all talk quickly about biometry, both as it's used on device and across your ecosystem. And maybe Brad, do you want to kick this one off?
Sure. So inside of EverID, there are currently 2 forms of biometry. We've built a backplane which allows us to plug in additional forms of biometry. Why did we do that? Because we are concerned about the commercially applicable biometry scanners that are out there. What is commercially viable today? Is a $4,000 iris scanner really a great entry point for giving aid to refugees? Probably not. Is a $250 smartphone? That's a little bit better, a little cheaper, a little easier to deal with. In the future, are we going to plug in alternate forms of identity? Certainly. One of the most exciting that I find is the intersinus rhythm between the P and the S waves in a heartbeat. That's actually 4 times more specific than a fingerprint. Okay? The Apple Watch 4 reads that. So we're on the cusp of seeing a new form of biometry come into the marketplace. That's why we built a backplane, so that we can plug everything in. As Mike was saying at the beginning, there's all these challenges of biometry in the field. I've spoken at length with some of the folks that are currently deploying iris scanning ATMs in Syria. And one of the gentlemen was sharing with me that he tried unsuccessfully for more than 30 minutes to enroll a lady at an ATM. And the problem is dust. It's not something they had factored into their thinking. So there's constantly not only dust in the air, but dust on the lens and dust in the camera. Okay? So you got problems. The reason we start with biometry and build up all of these attestations around biometry is that's the only way to make sure that an individual is an individual and is not creating Sybil attacks into a system. If I know that you're you and you are only you, I can give you an identity and start to do really interesting things. Kalia was alluding to the fact that we're starting in the frontier world, and that is exactly where we're starting for this exact reason. If you're a refugee getting off a boat or walking out of the water, what identity do you have? You have yourself. That's it. In security, there are 3 silos: what you have, who you are, what you know. In biometry, the first 2 collapse. Now you have who I am and what I know. So inside of our system, we have a biometry check and a PIN check, or a biometry check and a password check. Always the 2. Surveillance systems, like the one that is currently operated in London, doesn't have the second piece. They are not getting consent from the user to take their biometry. That's in essence what the PIN or the password is in our system. It's a consent metric. I've scanned you, but are you allowing me to use your biometry? Ah, you gave me your PIN, you are. Okay? That's a critical component for all of this. The user has to be in control and has to be giving assent positively to the use of their biometry.
Elizabeth?
So consent is interesting. I don't think you have legitimate consent if you don't have choice or you're locked out of a service or so I think there's a lot to unpack in there. I think in terms of biometrics, the reason we need them right now is so much of what we're building is dependent on the mobile device. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to connect something in the real world to something digitized. And so right now, the only way that we can really prove control of a device is the use of a biometric. So you have thumbprint or a face scan. It's so far from perfect, but it's really all that we have right now. If we're going to use mobile device-based wallets and agents to mediate these digital identifiers and the exchange of credentials for us, we have to have some way of proving ownership of the device. So it's really inadequate and it's really imperfect, but it's really the best that we have right now. And we all, I think, in the industry are worried about the shortcomings there, and we know how imperfect they are. So another population that's really interesting to me they tried to do thumbprints, I think, with surfers in the south of Portugal, and basically their fingerprints have eroded from what they do for a living. So there are a lot of imperfections. Yes, the iris scan as well. So the industry, I guess the good news is that we're aware and we're worried about the shortcomings and we're trying to solve for them. But we're also, as Shaylee mentioned, we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, and now that's super high risk in certain populations. So this is where I go back to, you need a governance framework. You can't rely upon the technology vendor and what they tell you about the technology. There needs to be a publicly auditable governance framework that governments and policymakers and regulators can look at and can understand what are the assumptions baked into these technologies, how are they deployed, what are the protections for individuals if something goes wrong, what is the dispute mechanism. There has to be that piece of it, and that's the part that I just see overlooked time and time again in this industry, is the overemphasis on the technology and the underemphasis on the governance. So I think, especially in DC and this audience, a lot of policymakers and regulators around, that's part of the struggle with the industry is we haven't been addressing those concerns nearly enough. From my perspective, it should be really prominent. So again, biometrics kind of where we are today, but if we think about the results we want to achieve and the policy ends and objectives, we should just think about biometrics as a tool and not as having any inherent value. It's about that fungibility problem of how do I know? It's the double spend problem of the human, right? This is why blockchain and identity are interesting, because blockchain is fundamentally, it's solving that double spend problem of this asset hasn't been allocated before. So if you think about your identity as a digital asset that has someone else trying to use your identity, or someone already used that identity, that's the core of why these two make sense together. But you can't really extend it beyond that. You have to be mindful of the context of rights, fundamental rights, civil rights, human rights around that. And that's why the governance piece is really critical, because the technology can solve that asset management piece. It can't solve everything else of who we are and what we have, and as Brad mentioned, what you bring and what you know. So I think that has to be core.
Shaylee, Clea, anything?
I agree on the governance framework. Consensus is kind of in the midst or at the beginning of creating a government stack, and identity is critical to that government stack. And so, the governance of identity, I love what Sovereign Trust Framework has done in being inclusive of, even in the development stages of that framework. And so we have a long way to go in actually implementing this framework and in systems, but we're at a starting point. And on the biometrics, I have the official Slack message from Reuven that biometrics are good for better protecting access to devices like smartphones. But there's still imperfections in the use of biometrics, but they're the best that we have right now. But there's still a lot of challenges there.
There's a paper that was written probably 6 months ago, and they were just pushing to get to the final draft. 6 principles for biometrics use in self-sovereign identity. And I think one of the most exciting things is that I can actually potentially store my own biometrics in my own personal cloud, and then I can authenticate to myself, right? So that I can show up and say, I've enrolled my biometrics. Some entity you might, have confidence in to have that happen has signed it. But you actually don't need to see it, and neither does the entity that enrolled it. I store my own biometrics, and I can authenticate against my own data store and assert my identity without it landing in a centralized database. And I actually think we need to broaden the conversation and get into the nitty-gritty of how these systems, and work with unlikely partners in figuring out how they should work, and even going to actually engaging with religious leaders. And religious minorities have been at the affect of really bad systems for a while. And in fact, there's a whole book called IBM and the Holocaust about how IBM's technologies enabled what happened in Nazi Germany to happen. And we have to get out in front of this and think, how are we actually building a system so bad stuff can't happen to at-risk groups? And do that now, not in 20, 25 years after they've been abused and used in really bad ways.
Well, one of the articles I read in writing this paper, I sort of put it down, and I'll go for a walk afterwards, was this horrible Wired article about the Rohingya, right? So in Bangladesh, they've been using biometry to do food distribution in the camps, and then the winds have changed, and the Bangladeshis now want to send the Rohingya back to Myanmar, complete with their biometric profiles. You don't need to stop and think for more than 2 seconds about how disturbing that is. So I think just, again, to bring it up a few levels, biometry if we just think about the basic idea of a username and a password, there are times when our biometry is our username, and there's times where our biometry is our password, right? And it's important to think about, like on my device, my fingerprint is what gets me into my device. There's my password. But for some of these platforms, we're talking about biometry as the base for your identity. And so what does it mean, and how do you spoof it? And we could go on for hours, but I want to get to questions. Brad, I didn't give you a chance.
So I do want to make one
And then Tim,
minor clarification. To Kalia's point, it's very important that the user is able to enroll themselves and is storing their information in a locker under their control. In our system, the locker is provided to the user when they enroll. The user's biometry inside of the EverID platform in Everest is resident in the platform, not on the device, which is a very big difference. So we can address the people without a smartphone. We can address the people without technology at all by being able to have the user assent to allowing their biometry to be used.
Right, which is, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, currently not true with UPort, right? You need a device to have right? And with Sovereign, you can do either. Okay, so again, this fascinating spectrum. Okay, so I hope there are some questions. If there aren't, I can keep this going all day long. But if you have questions, please raise your hand, and the mic is in the back. We'll start over here and go over.
Hi.
It's on.
Hi, Rory McMillan. I'm interested in where you started, which is how do we get to scale?
Yeah.
How do we get a tipping point shifting? And it strikes me that, Brad, you guys are going after government, and that seems like a very obvious kind of way to go after scale. I'm thinking of how India's Aadhaar scheme grew at huge pace. We're doing work with the World Bank on the ID4D initiative they have. One of the things that gives me nightmares is the centralized sort of approach around some of that. The nightmares are my dreams. I don't know whether they're real. What I'm really interested in is whether when you are looking to scale, is the way in here for you effectively to be almost kind of like an outsource, almost a procurement part of a centralized government system where you then build on the back of that your client relationships with the individuals who are building their data in your systems. After which you're then able to take that elsewhere. If that's the model, and you know, correct me if I'm getting it wrong. If that's the model, what in terms of infrastructure, policy, and particularly legal, and I think this comes to your point, Elizabeth, what's needed to make that really possible to scale out, so that enough people will trust and go with your brand, put themselves into the system, and then it'll be interoperable elsewhere. What sort of laws do I'm a lawyer, what kind of laws do we need to get governments to adopt so that this sort of thing can scale up, as opposed to us falling back each time to a government-initiated, budgeted, procured, controlled system, which is in some cases fine, but we were looking at a case in Somalia recently, and I don't know which faction of the government would be in charge of that. Right. You know, so can you just comment on that, please?
An excellent question. The market addressing is the first part of your question, which is how do we address the market? We're a B2B2C company. We make a community management platform, okay? We partner with governments or non-governmental organizations that have large communities that they need to manage and send value to. Almost any entity that you can think of needs to understand who they're sending the value to and needs to account for the value sent. It is critical in a lot of non-governmental organizations to show the custody of the disbursement all the way down to the individual so that they can turn back to their donors and say, look, 97% of the dollars you gave us arrived at these individuals and helped them, okay? That's a critical component. So we partner with large organizations that have communities that they need to manage. The two examples that I threw out earlier were the sovereign governments that we've announced, but we're working with non-governmental organizations to manage their communities as well. The second component of that was, what laws do we need to put in place to make sure that this is safe for the individual? And Somalia is a great example. There's a lot of flux in Somalia. There is a lot of change, and it is very rapid, and it's not always positive. And you start to get to the point of individuals within the country not trusting certain factions of the government, and that rolling up to a sentiment of not trusting the government at all. As a non-governmental organization and a nonprofit foundation, the Identity Network Foundation is actually engineered to sit and straddle over non-governmental organizations and governmental organizations to provide an extra-governmental identity system, okay? And that's important, especially when you talk about migration or the refugee crisis. The government that held your identity when you left the country that you left probably isn't providing that to the country that you arrived at. An example in Indonesia that cuts me very close, because I went out and met with these people. If you get taken in as a refugee in Indonesia, you get parked in a refugee camp for 7 years. You're not allowed to work. You're not allowed to leave the camp. You're not allowed to do anything. I met a physician who's a pediatrician from Pakistan who's in this camp who cannot help the other refugees. She can't practice medicine on the other refugees in the camp. And that completely destroyed my brain, because that's not really helping. So it's really important that the identity system needs to be, in my opinion, extra-governmental and an overlay. It's my data. I should choose to give it to a specific entity that I trust, the World Food Program, the government of Indonesia. And I trust that entity to be the one that enrolls me, but not to hold my data.
Yeah. Let Elizabeth go on. Yeah.
Is your customer the government that you work for, or is it individuals whose identity or loyalty kind of?
So the individual is always in control. It's about the individual. We are helping the individual to gain access to certain services that they couldn't access without an identity. And that's how we view it. It's about this individual gaining something from this social contract that they're working within. We don't realize it, but almost everything that we do every day is a social contract.
Yeah. Elizabeth, you want to?
Yeah, well, I think you mentioned B2B2C, so I think this idea of selling products and services B2B that are then enhancing the B2C relationship. And so I think a lot of the business models are structured that way. In terms of the laws, and the approach there, so I think we need, if we're going to put the individual at the center, and if we're going to expect the individual to take on more responsibility in this, which is what we're asking them to do, we're asking them to manage these, these technologies, we're asking them to understand what's happening kind of under the hood, we're asking them to take on more responsibility, then in turn we need more protection. So we can't just say, we're building these platforms, we've got these products, we're not liable for anything now, it's all on the user. We can't say that, because the user doesn't have, there are information asymmetries, there are imbalances of power, there's a lack of bargaining power. In order to counterbalance this individually managed, self-sovereign approach, we need to enhance individual rights. So things like the GDPR obviously are a really good start, and we see laws around the world that are trying to mirror that in terms of data protection. EIDAS is another interesting one, which is the European Identity Authentication and Trust Services Standard. That's really important in the cross-border interoperable context, because what we know now is that people are more mobile. We change jobs, we change countries, we change contexts. We can't have identities that are limited and siloed in that way. So we need to build, so the reason EIDAS is particularly interesting is because it's about how do we accept digital signatures and timestamps and other authentication mechanisms cross-border and in different contexts? How do we modernize them? How do we empower the individual who moves from one country to another or changes employers to still be themselves and to have the proof of that? So I think all of the laws that are focused on consumer protection is another area that's really not sufficiently focused on right now, but I think is increasingly important, is transparency has to become a huge piece of this, because there's that big information asymmetry there, and people don't understand really how these technologies work, and so they don't know what they're authorizing. So we can't have any kind of meaningful consent if they're not fully aware, which means we can't have the 100-page privacy policies. And lawyers have to take responsibility. We can't be enabling these bad business practices, right, that are obfuscating all this from the individual. So I think that's where the legal profession is also more prominent now. I think this idea of legal engineers and policy engineers becoming part of the product design, part of this privacy and data protection by design and default. Before it wasn't perhaps as important, but now we really can't be arm's length from the tech. We have to be in there early building along with the engineers and those who are the developers who are writing the code, and side by side. And that's been our approach. And so I think there are path dependencies that are built into some of this tech that we can't undo. So if we're not part of the conversation early on, then there are serious concerns raised. But I think that the individually focused individual rights laws that are now, like I said, sort of graduating to the next level of the digital world are really important.
Thank you. And before we go to Micah next, and then to the back of the room, I just want to say, we're always encouraged to have a diverse panel, but a diverse panel does not just mean gender balance and racial diversity. We have an amazing lawyer, technologist, economic development professional, and I can't really clearly define his description, but we have this incredible diversity of perspectives and expertise on this panel, which I'm so grateful for. So to Micah, and then over to Alan.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for the incredible insights today. I'm Tamika Tillerman with New America. As we have looked at these issues, we see immense potential, and that's why we spend a lot of time on these challenges, just as Mike does. But the stumbling block that we keep getting tripped up on is the restoration of lost keys. And I know we've had a little bit of discussion about that today, but I'd love it if we could dig deeper, because ultimately, if you're going to have self-sovereign identity, you need some mechanism of restoring access to that identity if it is lost for whatever reason. And that seems to be a challenge for which nobody that we've encountered has developed a satisfying answer at this point, but hopefully one of you has, so we look forward to that.
Let's plow through it.
Yeah, it's easy. This is a known problem. There's a lot of research that's gone into it. In fact, some of it has been funded by Anil John, who's the head of Identity and Privacy Portfolio at Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology. And I think within the next 6 months, we need to have some really focused work amongst all the people working on the problem to move it forward. I think the answer will end up being that I store shards of a recovery key with institutions that have a fiduciary duty to me.
Brad, 5 minutes or less, preferably 2 minutes
Yeah.
or less.
So a couple of things that are critically important about this. As all Ethereum wallets, we are a public-private key system, okay? Giving the private key to the individual is giving razor blades to a child. This is a horrible idea. So we make it very difficult for the user to get to their private key intentionally. The public key is a different story. The public key is not only on the ledger, but is many places. What's more important is how do I recover my identity, not just the key. So there's a couple of examples that are near and dear to my heart because they're absolutely the corner cases of biometry. There was a lady that is the non-Aadhaar. She was in an automobile accident. She lost both of her hands and she lost both of her eyes. So she's not a person as far as the Indian government is concerned. Okay? They didn't have a third backup mechanism. That's horrible. The other side of the coin is there's an immigrant that crossed the border into Greece, spent 25 years cooking Syrian food in Greece, and went back to Syria because he got deported by Greece because he didn't have any documentation. You're not supposed to be here. So we sent you back to Syria. He arrived back in Syria. He has no documentation there either. He's a non-person. He got deported from one country and accepted back into another country, but he can't do anything. Okay? So it's not so much the key pair that I need to recover, it's how do I recover my identity? Inside of the Everest platform, your biometry is you. And we have the capacity to take all 10 of your fingerprints and your facial biometry. We currently have the corner case problem just like Aadhaar. If you're in a Deadpool-style accident and everything gets burned off, what do you do? Okay? To Elizabeth's point, you need to have a governance model which allows for an individual to go to some oracle to be able to regain their identity. Inside of our system, it's a combination of 3 factors. You have to go through a whole series of knowledge unlocks. You have to go through a whole series of transaction unlocks. What were the last transactions you did that you know of? Okay? So temporal knowledge. And the third aspect is your PIN and password, the knowledge of your system. So that's how we do recovery inside of Everest.
On Uport, they're figuring out that, I mean, they're at the cusp of figuring out the restoration of lost keys, and I think, you know, we do need to address this very quickly, very soon. But to Brad's point, I mean, I have been in Malawi doing, you know, work around mobile money acceptance, okay? And this was the big thing with international development and, you know, which kind of led me to the identity piece. But there are people where you're like, okay, 4-digit PIN. They, you know, they're illiterate. They do not, they're like, I don't know when my birthday was. So when you say, just put in your birthday. You know, these are the things that, and then they go to the phone station. I'm just giving you some color to what we're dealing with in a lot of places. They go to charge their phones. They haven't noted which phone is theirs. And then they all come back. They get somebody else's phone, and they try and put in their PIN that they created a number against, and they don't. It doesn't go through because they have somebody else's phone. So these are real things that a lot of communities are dealing with, and we have to design for that. The community attestations are amazing. I think that is a huge piece, but the governance and how do you recover your identity, having a transactional identity, something that you, and these different attestations, I mean, this is something we need to put a lot of thought behind.
Yeah, so Evernim has the contract with the Department of Homeland Security to do this decentralized key management, or DKMS, pilot, which is, we're in the second phase of it now. It's one of the hardest problems to solve, but without it, you can't have self-sovereign identity. And the problem is, if it's a fully hosted, I appreciate what Brad's saying about, you know, the user doesn't access their private key, but I think the problem with that approach is, you know, if you're familiar with, for example, Coinbase Wallet, you don't own your cryptocurrency because you don't have access to those keys. So if you lose your Coinbase account or you're locked out of the service, you don't have your crypto anymore, right? So we're worried about that because, again, to be truly self-sovereign, there has to be a degree of which you have full control over that, and it's portable and all the things that we've talked about. But it's really hard. And that's why I think as the counterbalance to, if we're going to push that to the user, there need to be enhanced protections for them, and there needs to be extreme transparency. And so the thing that we're trying to do is build out, and I think Uport's been working on something similar as well around social recovery, and there's, you know, or a sharded approach, as Kalia mentioned, where you can kind of distribute pieces of a composite of your identity to, you know, different people that you might trust. They might be an institution like a bank or, you know, some other fiduciary, you know, your attorney. Probably don't trust your attorney, but friends and family and different people, and piece that together to kind of reconstruct who you are. And in some ways, it's like it is in the real world now, you know, where if you lost your passport or your wallet, or you have to kind of go through that process of that composite of reestablishing the different pieces and achieving some kind of coherent identity. But we're so far from it, and I think in the interim we will see a lot of these kind of hosted solutions, and I think the risk is that if we accept those as, you know, enough and don't take it further, then again we don't move past the status quo right now. We're not fully managing and not fully in control of our own identifiers.
Alan?
Oh, thanks very much for a fascinating panel. You know, when I look at this area, just an observation and then 2 questions. One of the things I feel would help people is if there was a much clearer delineation between what it was, the kind of problem that you're trying to solve. And I mean, there's a whole set of discussions about getting credentials under the user control, generally in pretty data-rich and credential-rich environments like this, and relying, as you said, on these various databases, some of which are public databases, government-issued databases. And that's a very different problem from the problem of trying to establish some kind of identity database in a system that is very credential poor. It may be rich in community attestation, but that doesn't necessarily help you in terms of a broader thing. These are very different kinds of problems, and I think it would be a good idea to, and particularly if the emphasis is on the developing world, because I don't know where you start and where you begin. So the other thing is two questions. One is the question of uniqueness. I mean, uniqueness is a very difficult thing. For many purposes, you don't need uniqueness. For transactional identity, you don't actually need uniqueness for most of it, right? But when you need uniqueness, it seems to me very difficult to reconcile that with the prospect that your data is under your own control. Because if I'm dealing with a biometric type system for uniqueness, my data by definition has to be available to check the identity of other people. And there's no way you can pretend that it's actually under my control for that kind of thing, right? They have to know my fingerprints, they have to be able to access them, they have to be able to access my face. I see that this is a question. So how is it possible to do a biometric deduplication and yet keep data under my control? That would be a question. Another question is the credentials. When you're looking at the linkage to credential systems, how are you dealing with the updating of those credential systems? Is it a static or a dynamic updating? And I ask because, for example, I have a South African passport, and the value of a South African passport has gone up and down depending on the integrity of the Home Office, right? When they start screwing around and giving unauthorized passports, the value of my passport goes down. I then have to go for visas. This is historically what happens. So simply saying I have a passport doesn't really solve the question of whether at a particular time I really do have a valid passport or not. Just a few questions. On the last point about the management of exceptions, I think this is really important. We're doing some field work in India looking at the way in which different states are using the system, and it's clear that where you have a very good human accountability mechanism for dealing with problems, you actually have a much less difficulties than where you don't. So you need a very clear accountability system for the technology failures or the people failures with the technology. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, who wants to? There were at least 4 questions there, and I want to point out that, I don't know if you'll permit me, Alan, I want to recast Alan's observation as a question. I think these platforms do approach the developing world context very differently, and if we could just speak to that. Anyone want to start?
Well, I want to share why I was. So I think the technologies and the mathematics behind it are incredibly sophisticated, and they allow you to do things that seem impossible but are actually magic. So there are mathematical ways to establish uniqueness that do not involve having a giant database of everybody's fingerprints and biometrics. And we're just at the cusp of being able to bring those up at scale. And in fact, iRespond establishes uniqueness without storing any of the actual biometric data. And that's in fact their value proposition, is they take a biometric, they generate a 12-digit random number, and they throw away the actual data that created it.
But they could recreate it if they wanted to.
Well, if the person shows up again, the same random number gets generated out of their biometric, and you can run it against the thing. I think the idea that the only way to do uniqueness is with a giant biometric database is false, and we actually need more research and more inquiry about how we solve this problem for the people who really need to solve it. And we don't have, I can't give you the 3-word answer right here, but we need to, it's possible, and we need to really push governments that are thinking the only way to do uniqueness is a giant biometrics database to rethink that assumption and to work with the technologists who are working on alternative ways to do it.
So, Alan, do you want to? Yeah, yeah.
We'll keep talking about it, yeah.
So
What I'm basically concerned about is, as far as I know, it's not possible to compare biometrics very accurately in the encrypted space. You're talking about encrypting them, and as far as I know,
That's not what I'm
since these are pattern recognitions and they're not exact, right, the same fingerprint will not necessarily generate exactly the same random number. So I had thought that that technology was not sufficiently accurate for mass, and I don't know what you think, Brad. But can you compare your biometrics in encrypted space?
So it's an excellent question, and it's actually called a Sybil attack. Okay, so Sybil attack is I want to create 75 different Facebook accounts to vote up a specific thing on Facebook. Well, I shouldn't be able to do that in the real world. I should only be me. Okay? So inside of our system, one of the first steps that we do is we take your biometry. We take all 11 points of biometry, your 10 fingers and your face, and we take that entire stack of 11 objects and we hash that. Okay? Now I have a database that's anonymized of just hashes of 11 objects. And the first step at the next enrollment is I take those 11 objects, I hash them, and I compare them to the Sybil database. Hey, is Sybil in there? No? Great, then you can be enrolled. Okay? So we're actually scrubbing people on the enrollment side based upon this superset of their biometry. Okay? The second component of when we're using biometry inside of the system, it's a specific component of the biometry for a specific unlock. So if I'm walking up to get food aid, taking my facial biometry and me inputting my PIN should be a sufficient check for me to receive this food aid. Going to Kalia's point of uniqueness in a mathematical space, that is what the public key is. It's a mathematically unique object. So by pairing this 11 object array of biometry with a public key, now I'm uniquely unique. I know those two things. And those two things being paired, now I'm able to do a biometrically unique individual in the world. Now, iRespond has a 12-digit number. That's a little problematic in my world. 12 digits, when you run that all out, is about, well, it's sub 500 million objects. Okay? I built my system for 20 billion objects. Why? Well, you know, right now we're at 2.5 billion people have been born and died on the planet up until 2000. Right now we're sitting on top of 7.5 billion people. So if I can't enroll everyone, I can't attack human trafficking. I can't attack these problems of cross-border migration. I can't attack these problems because I simply don't know. And that's unacceptable for me. I need to be able to enroll everybody. That's the only way you can do away with human trafficking, for example.
And you're saying, I think Alan was asking, those fingerprints and face scans, is the tech is at a point where you think it is creating a unique identity that is replicable?
Yes.
Okay.
In an array of 11 objects, yes.
Okay. So then,
if you're walking in with just a facial scan,
yeah,
that is insufficient.
Okay. And then Shaylee and Elizabeth, just to review, how good is your, and then I'll come back to you at the end, Brett. How good is your, what does your platform do in the developing world context where we have maybe people with no devices? The question about uniqueness and control, if I control all my data, how do you check that I'm me? So I think you spoke to that a bit about with the hash. Exception management and dynamic credentials. Shaylee, do you want to?
I'll let her go first.
Okay.
Well, I think it's to Alan's point. You know, when do you need this? I don't think we ask the question enough. What do we need uniqueness? There are a lot of situations where we don't. Again, if you go back to government services, the government really doesn't need to know that you're you. They need to know that you haven't accessed this particular public benefit or you haven't spent their money, right? It shouldn't matter that you're you. It shouldn't matter how old you are or anything like that. It just matters that you haven't double spent something that's been allocated on the public from public funds, right? And that's where we get so fixated on an identity world. We talk about our data as a proxy for identity. We talk about privacy, and we talk about our data. We don't talk about our privacy. So why should, for example, a particular government agency need to know that you're you to access healthcare services, right? They shouldn't. They just need to know that they have allocated sufficient funds and that, again, they haven't been double spent. So I think we get really in the weeds with this stuff, but we don't step back and think, when is it important to be non-fungible and when does it not matter, right? When does it, you just need to be enrolled in school, and it shouldn't matter what religion your parents are or which district that you live in. So I think we approach it again through governance first. We approach it through the policy ends and the protections for the individual. And from that perspective, then you can talk about what's the best technology solution to deploy. You don't start from the tech and say, we've got really good biometric intake devices, right? And we're going to deploy those because they're ready, and then we'll figure out the rest. We start from, what are we trying to achieve? And then what's the best way to achieve that? And I think particularly in the developing world, we run the risk in this industry sometimes of experimenting on vulnerable populations, and that's not okay, right? So we have to think about what are the needs there, not from how can we deploy the solution quickly because here's a population that doesn't have any rights, so we're going to go ahead and just experiment on them. No, that's absolutely the wrong approach. It has to be, there's a real need here. I love the title of the report, is Nail finds a hammer. I mean, it's brilliant because that's exactly right. That's what we all want, and I think that also is going to be the tipping point, is when the nail finds the hammer, right? So there has to be, we have to flip the sort of perspective that we're looking at this from, and not start from the tech, but start from what we want to achieve and enable, and that's been our perspective.
Yeah, I don't work for UPort. I don't know much about UPort because I'm just starting to learn more, but I mean, I agree completely that the work around zero knowledge data stores and governance and kind of what is the minimum amount of information that we need to share in order for a transaction to take place it's going to take a change in our mindset and the mindsets of large institutions who deliver those services. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and I don't have a good answer for you.
Do you want to
add? I just want to add one thing about the question around encrypted data and encrypted search. We have an expert in the room here. You can talk to Ian later about new technologies to basically be able to search encrypted information and encrypted data. And that will be a huge breakthrough because that has been one of the challenges, one of the vulnerabilities is that in order for these systems to ingest those sorts of things, you have to expose the data. And so if we have that combination of zero-knowledge capabilities plus encrypted search, then you open up a whole array of things where you can search these encrypted biometric templates that have been hashed and not have to actually go and identify the individual. So there are some breakthroughs that are happening there.
Tons of open questions. Let's, Tim, do you have the mic? Let's go, let's bounce up. Let's take 3 questions. 1, 2, 3, and yeah.
Hey, my name is Ashwita. I am a PhD student at American University. Thanks, Mike, for bringing up the point about diversity earlier. I think a great addition to the panel might have been someone from a developing country who's working in development in the country. Addition to identity folks, no, all respect to y'all. I have a set of questions starting with, I'll try to keep it brief. You said, Brad, you said you work in Indonesia providing liquid propane, et cetera, but I missed your presentation earlier, so indulge me if you already talked about this, but if your solution is based on mobile phones and if your solution is based on mobile internet, and Indonesia has like less than 40% of mobile internet penetration, how are you not helping further the digital divide? And who exactly are you serving? I mean, this is to everyone, not just Brad, my apologies. And who exactly are you serving? And if you're going to push the liability and the responsibility for securing the data onto these people who are just coming on the internet, how is education not a bit, how are you promoting education of security, awareness, et cetera, among this population? And I also want to raise, Kalia mentioned earlier to Brad about how, in the ecosystem that Everest works in or EverID works in, open source is not, fundamentally important. is that not undemocratic, especially if they're working in partnership with governments? And is it not necessary for developing countries to have, you know, open source technology pushed by the government? And also to Elizabeth, you mentioned GDPR. I'm wondering how blockchain as like as a source technology would fundamentally work if someone were to register, conduct transactions using Evernym, and they wanted their transaction removed off the internet or off the blockchain. How would you do that?
Let's keep taking questions. Thank you. Those are good ones.
So this has been really fascinating, and I appreciate all of you and your perspective. It's been great. My name's Amy. I'm with Cadasta Foundation, and I wanted to take it back to the property rights piece again, Mike raised earlier. So we work in property rights, and one of the what we were created to do is to try to help the over 1 billion people in the world who live without secure land tenure take matters into their own hands by giving them tools to map and document their own property rights, property and resource rights at the community level. And we, that data is owned by them. We store it on our platform, et cetera. So there's a lot of parallels here about establishing, a land identity or, property rights identity using community attestations, using, videos of people agreeing on boundaries, or using any kind of like payments, or there's all kinds of documentation we can use in addition to geospatial data and all of that kind of stuff. So a lot of the issues around who owns the data, giving the data, allowing communities to control their own data on their own property rights, et cetera. So we're dealing with a lot of same issues, including open versus commercial tools and platforms. So been dealing with a lot of the same issues. I guess one of the reasons I wanted to come here is because, we're starting to think about, in addition to the issue around property rights and land ownership and community lands, and for indigenous or individuals, it can be urban, rural, anywhere. We're thinking about, we are, in essence, establishing an identity for people who aren't documented in any major way. Many of them don't have identity. So is there a way that we can partner on this? What can we do together? Is it too soon for us to think about linking the community-based mapping process and documentation with the digital ID process? We're thinking about how to scale. We're thinking about how to work. We work B&B, but as you said, we're also B&B focused on the consumer, on the customer, and what benefits the consumer and the customer. So we're grappling with a lot of this in terms of scaling, and also something that's sustainable, something that's a platform that's not going to go away 5 years from now because donor funding runs out or whatever. So all of these things, we'd love to be able to do something around digital ID that links to us, and we're also interested in like addressing for people, these addressing systems that are also trying to create an identity for a location that doesn't have any, any location anywhere. So these are things that are floating around with us, and I'd really love to continue the conversation. But I guess the question is it too soon for us to think about that? What could we do? And then the issue of disincentive by governments. There are millions of government workers out there whose worst nightmare is to not have to be the processor of the, it's same thing in land rights. The reason why Cadasta even exists at all is because the government systems don't work for vulnerable people, and the land registry systems don't work. And so by bringing these innovations and these disruptions, how do we deal with that disincentive of getting them on board?
So before we take this third question, please, I just want to, one of the introductory points we make in this is that one of the reasons we think self-sovereign identity is inevitable is as we've learned listening to this panel and hearing passionate debates about DIDs and biometry and private key recovery. This is complicated. It's really complicated, and Amy and her organization's incredible work on land rights. And it's unfair, in my opinion, sorry to pick on you, Amy, to ask Amy and her team to now become identity experts. much as it's unfair to ask anyone out there doing whatever it is they do well, to now, identity in a digital age, in a world of biometry, has become so tricky that it actually makes sense we would see a Cadasta partner with someone on this stage or other provider in partnership to protect this precious issue of identity while doing the important work of Cadasta. So that was an awesome question. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Kevin Barthel from Global Land Alliance. I'm really glad I went after Amy because it's a good segue to my question. We work at a practical level trying to update or modernize land registries, property registries, and we feel that technology is already there. You know, you've got global geographic referencing systems or addressing systems, you've got Web 3.0, you've got the blockchain, and now self-sovereign identity, which is super important to link the object and with the subject of the parts of the property rights registry. My global question, for probably more for Mike in New America, is why do we even need a government-run land registry, right? Okay, we have the technology, right? But then my specific question for the panel, and I want to hear how it is addressed with sovereign identity, is our biggest problem in land to try to move the land registry out of the government is that agencies, government agencies, have administrative processes that they resolve conflicts, or it goes to a court, okay? So if the government agency doesn't accept the information, or if the judge, the court, doesn't accept the information, it's not valid, okay? So the question for the panel is, how does self-sovereign identity, how are you being accepted? Because I heard the word adoption, and I heard the word acceptance, and those are very important for our sector to figure out how governments and how courts are going to accept and adopt self-sovereign identity. Thank you.
Okay, so we're technically at time, but if the audience will indulge us, I'm going to let us just plow through answers to that. Yep. Start at the top. Brad, Brad, you're exacerbating the digital divide because you need phones, correct?
Not so much.
Okay.
Okay, so I spent 16 years working in mobile telephony. I built a bunch of the technologies that actually make your phones work. Inside of almost all of the developing world, 2.5 and 3G is totally fine. 4G is coming quickly, and in many locations, 5G is actually being bandied about as a replacement for cable modems, for example, broadband access. So the mobile infrastructure in Indonesia is actually quite good. One of the things that the Indonesian government did in 2002 was they created a system of mobile phone agents. So even in rural towns, there is an individual who is appointed as the phone booth for this town, and there is actually service in all of these little rural towns. We don't require the user to possess technology. We require our partner's agent to possess technology. Most of our partners are in specific locations. For example, the TNP2K operates LPG depots in specific locations to distribute the liquid propane gas. Those regions are all well covered by mobile.
Thank you. And then there was a question, Kalia, about open source and democracies. You want to?
Yeah, I think those are really good questions, and you should keep asking them of people developing and deploying these technologies in the developing world. Critical questions. Can I answer Amy's question?
Absolutely. I was going to go through them in order, but if you want to jump in.
Well, yeah. So I think that there is enormous potential. One of the reasons I've been excited about these technologies is because it kind of allows existing governments to do what they're already doing in a digitally native form, but it also allows new entrants into the credential market, right? So an indigenous community that's documenting its land also knows who is in its community, and they could pop up a server and issue verifiable credentials to the members of their community. Totally possible, super early, but you could totally do that within a year, working with this community and use the open standards and leverage open source code that different people are building, so it's less expensive. You don't have to code it from scratch. super experimental, but
Or
totally
you could just
possible.
partner with one of these platforms.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, great. Yeah, it's totally possible.
Yeah.
Just to riff on Kylie, the who owns the data component of your question I thought was really interesting, and is a difficult question to answer in many locations. When you get to indigenous peoples inside of certain governmental areas, inside of certain governments, they are relegated to the margin, and they are not inclusively accepted into the community. The most significant thing you can do with a land title is associate it with a durable identity.
Yep.
Once you've done that, you can bank that land. You can create a relationship with another institution around that land. So having, we have a partner that recorded 35% of a country's land titles onto the blockchain before they came to us and said, yeah, we've got all these land titles, but we have a couple of problems. We're not really sure who owns the land, so the land that we've recorded is, all of these recordings aren't super valuable. And we were like, because if you don't know, if the government doesn't understand whose land it is, and no one has recorded a change of title, you have a big problem. Real close to home, New Orleans, in the 4th District, where did they store the land titles? In the basement of City Hall. What flooded during the hurricane? The basement of City Hall. So there are major tracts of land in the 4th District in New Orleans where nobody has an idea of who owns that land unless a bank holds the title transfer. That's it. That's the only thing. And if the bank was still holding that. So you have all of these properties where nobody, and this is in a first world country, nobody knows who actually owns this corner.
Yeah, so we're going over time, and I apologize to the audience. I knew this would happen, so I should have been ready for it. I'm going to give Shaylee and Elizabeth both a minute, and then I'm going to take a minute, and then I promise I'm going to stop this.
Okay.
So please go.
So TurboTax was not invented by the government. It became so popular that government eventually adopted TurboTax, right? So let's think about that in terms of land registry. You got to get to scale, and then they'll just adopt. The courts will accept it, right? So that's number one. 2, it's not too early to be thinking about this, and I think we should all continue to have this conversation. Consensus has a product called Tara, which is already looking into, has done some proofs of concept in India and in Southeast Asia around decentralized land property registries, and I think identity is a core component of that. And I think the last thing I wanted to say is around the developing countries and democracy and open source. I think it's essential for organic growth to take place out of these countries. We don't want Silicon Valley-driven solutions like we saw in Web 2.0. We want things to take place from bottom up, right? We want people to create the solutions for their own problems where it makes sense for them. It's very user-centered design, and I'll just stop talking now.
It's a shame. Thank you.
I think that's why the open approach is so important, because what we need these alternative registries, right? We need, for example, in the context of music rights, so a lot of American artists have basically copyrighted traditional folk songs that belong to communities and to people that originally, right, authored these works. And because they were locked out of these official registries and these systems and these ways for capturing these rights, we've basically taken away things that are inherent to a community or to people. And we see the same thing happening in the real property context. So I think that the beauty of it, as Kalia mentioned, is these communities can now, if these things are open, they're open source, they're open standards, they're openly, they have open governance frameworks that are auditable and accessible, they can use the tools to build their own alternative sources and their own alternative registries. And I think what we'll see is a convergence. We'll see kind of the existing sources of truth and the places that we, normally go to, the governments and central banks, and we'll have those credentials and those standards, that are, and where they're working, they'll continue to work. But then we'll see kind of this organic growth, as Shaylee mentioned, coming from sort of alternative sources, and we'll see them sort of converge. And the beauty of SSI and self-sovereign identity is that these composite, these permutations, these myriad opportunities to combine different sources to contextualize an identity for a particular use case, for a particular purpose, and not have to have an oversharing in every instance because it's the only mechanism that we have, or a complete lack of trust because we don't have any mechanism for establishing that trust. So I think this multi-source, diverse approach is really critical. And to the question about GDPR, yesterday I've been part of this blockchain observatory. The working group paper on GDPR and blockchain came out, so I can share the link with you, and we'll probably answer a lot of the questions that you have there. But it's a really important question.
3 things. Please read my paper, newamerica.org FPR. That's number 1. Number 2, I love the last question. Why do we need government anymore? This is crazy. We have the tech. Let's just do this. Somewhat less provocatively, I would say, government historically has done registries. And if we go back a century, there was one place with the resources and the people, the educated, who could manage this data. The tech is radically. Populate these with an external party saying, yes, this 3 words address is occupied by this person. And here's the imagery, right? So I'm talking about future. So I think government does have to be different. The most important thing is thanking the panelists for their generosity of their time and knowledge. And thank you for your time.